Jonathon Jakubowicz. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say congratulations on a fantastic piece of work. I really, really enjoyed your film. I think it's very timely and topical and exactly the kind of thing we need to be, exactly the way that we need to be looking at this kind of stuff. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, so just to kind of get us started here, like it's a very intense topic and it's very nuanced, and that's kind of like the point of your film. But take me through like what inspired you to kind of go down this journey. Like I know in the film you talk about being from Venezuela, seeing the similarities and stuff like that. But kind of if you don't mind, take me through the beginning of your journey from getting this idea to actually starting to realize it to sitting in front of former prime ministers and talking to them.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody in the audience who came to see this film. Um, it all started, I'll tell you, my mother lives in Tel Aviv. She moved for like about 15 years ago, and I have spent a ton of time in Israel since she moved there. And every time that I'm not in Israel, I'm also very glued to the news about Israel. So I've been very in touch with the political situation and all that stuff. And my mother, ever since she moved to Israel, has been, until 2023, has been speaking nothing but joy. She's a scientist. She had a great team. She was very identified with the country. She rides her bike to the lab and does scientific work with Tel Aviv University. But then suddenly in 2023, when the protest movement started, she completely changed her tune and started talking about, what they're doing to democracy and all that stuff, and talking in terms that I had heard in Venezuela, I had heard in the United States with the polarization in the first Trump presidency. I had never heard in Israel. The level of vitriol and the level of the ability to call each other enemies, to me was mind blowing, because if there is one country that is cohesive at least at a basic level, is Israel. It's a country that clearly has a purpose, that clearly has a shared goal. It is collectivist in many ways. From the beginning, it was conceived as a country for every kind of Jew. And it was mind blowing for me to hear that level of division. And I started, at first I didn't take it seriously. I felt like, this is probably just what happens in times of peace. They have nothing, no one to fight against. But then I saw that it was getting serious, and I started getting really worried because, as I say in the documentary, my nation crumbled. Venezuela crumbled because of internal divisions. And I felt that, if Israel is destroyed by enemies is one thing, but if Israel is destroyed from within, and I didn't do anything about it, I would never forgive myself. So I said, let's go there. Let's truly understand what's going on, and let's see how we can help, if we can help in any way. And that's how we approached the whole thing from the beginning. We started writing letters saying, think of us as the distant cousin who's coming to the home of the couple before they get a divorce to see if the marriage can be saved. And with that, approach, a lot of people were open to us, and that's how we started, and that's how we ended up interviewing so many important people, so many people that we've heard about since we were kids, and it was an incredible experience for sure.
Okay, yeah, very cool. Honestly, I think a lot of us could identify with what you're saying of feeling like that cousin that's kind of looking from the outside in and saying, "Why is there so much trouble in the home? Why don't you guys love each other?" And I think a lot of us would identify with like kind of your feelings as things kind of started piling up with the political situation in 2023 and going all the way until today. Um, so let me ask you this. So it's a very intense topic, and you definitely go and talk to people on both sides of a very divisive kind of conversation. But I think that the film does a really good job of staying neutral and staying kind of balanced and offering everybody the opportunity to kind of speak their mind and giving us a comprehensive view of this. So my question around that is, Was there, when you were talking to people, when you were editing the movie, was there anything that was like really challenging to leave out of the movie that just couldn't make the final cut, but you were kind of struggling around like, how do I fit this in? Can I fit this in? Should it belong?
I mean, there were, I don't know, about 20 something interviews. All of them were an hour long, and all of them I am thinking of publishing in their entirety because the incredible thing about the people we spoke with is how intelligent they are. You know, the fact
Mhm.
that they completely disagree with each other is one thing, but when you sit down with them, they convince you pretty much of everything they want to convince you of, and even though it's the opposite of what the other guy just convinced you of. And I feel like in the documentary, there's that, you know, you're constantly being, you know, okay, he has a point, he has a point. So there's a ton of stuff that we left out, but you know, the end of the day, when you were doing a film, whether it's a feature fiction or a documentary, what you need is to truly just keep what is essential for the message to come across. And I think, you know, the purpose of that of this documentary was fulfilled by what we left in. You know, there
Mhm.
were a lot more discussions about the religious in Israeli society and the challenges that exist about them not joining the military and all that stuff, which I found very interesting and fascinating to understand from an outside perspective. I didn't think it was relevant at the end of the day to go that deep into that discussion, which is incredibly important and incredibly relevant, but it wasn't as relevant what when you see the whole arc of the film. Because at the end of the day, when we were shooting the film, we didn't realize what was coming, you know, and everybody, even on the ground, was telling us the problem you're going to have is you're not going to have a third act because we're just going to continue fighting each other. Little did they know that the third act was coming, you know, and it was more horrific than anything we could have anticipated. But that ended up being the film, you know, the instinct that I had that this division only leads to destruction and makes countries vulnerable, and it's the beginning of a true painful hit that happens on any nation was true. And once that happened and once that became the third act that we were leading towards, everything else felt less important. It was only about understanding Israeli society, what they were fighting, what are the arguments, what are the challenges, and that's, you know, and how did they lead to this moment in October 7 when everything, you know, crumbled.
Were you in Israel in October 7th? Like I saw some of the interviews are obviously like about a month before October 7th. Were you there?
No, we left right before October 7. We came for Yom Kippur to Los Angeles,
Mhm.
and so it was right before. Um, you know, it was pretty devastating for us, you know, to when it happened because the feeling we had constantly while being there was the feeling of a train that's heading to a crash, you know, and we came here and I remember I did a Q&A in Wilshire Temple, which is the biggest community in Los Angeles, and you know the people in the crowd were, you know, somewhere with the right, somewhere with the left, and I remember telling them, you don't understand the only role for the people in the diaspora to play right now is to get Israelis to understand each other because they're heading towards disaster. And it was so clear to me, and I remember in October 7 when the news started coming, you know, me and my wife who produced the film were looking at each other thinking this is it, you know, this is what we were feeling, this is what the nation was heading towards. And it's, you know, it's part of what's uncomfortable in a way about the film because it doesn't put blame on a specific section of society. Everybody has a responsibility, which is always the case, you know. And I think, you know, Israelis learned the lesson at least for a few months, you know, then after a while they went back to fighting each other. But I do think they did learn the lesson in a large way, and I think it's a different kind and different intensity of infighting, and they understood that there are real enemies that are not the people who simply think differently. And I think it's a lesson that a lot of people in the world should learn about their own countries. You know, I see it all the time in the United States right now. I live in California, but I have family in Florida. And if you hear the way people from California talk about the people in Florida, or people in Florida talk about the people in California, it's insane. You know, it's unacceptable. It's completely ridiculous. And everybody's, you know, it's talking about each other as enemies. And I am worried because I've seen it twice already in two different nations, and I think it's the sign of the times, you know, how in so much of the Western world, everything is crumbled into tribes and everybody is completely convinced of their own ideas without realizing that they share, you know, 80% or more of their ideas, and there's just a, you know, small percentage of disagreements that can be worked through civilized conversation and democracy.
Yeah, honestly, I really couldn't agree more. And I think the film does a really good job of kind of leaving it of like your last message at the end there is like just listen to each other, just talk to each other, right? And just reach out for the nuance. And um, I guess, do you think that like obviously the situation in Israel over the past 3 years since October 7th has changed dramatically in many ways, but then in other ways, and especially with like a lot of the topics that you cover in the film, some of those issues have never gone away. Do you think that now in this post October 7th, post long term conflict world that Israel finds itself in, do you think that we're closer to finding that balance and coming together, or do you think that Israel's kind of still got this wide divide and is drifting further apart?
Well, I think it's you know, it's tough to judge right now, and especially it's gonna be tough to judge in the next 6 months because they have elections,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, the kind of stuff we're gonna hear from politicians in Israel in the next 6 months are going to make us all blush, you know, because it's gonna get really intense and really nasty. There's nothing worse than election season in Israel, and to have that happen when the entire spotlight of the world is on Israel is gonna be a nightmare. So I'm not looking forward to the next 6 months. But, you know, regardless of the result of that election, I do think the next government is going to be government of the center more than a government that includes extremes. And I think that's going to have a healing effect on society. Already, most of the candidates are talking about unity, you know, and the end of division, and that I feel is very important. And I, you know, I think it's a product of the parliamentary system that they have, that, you know, small parties can have a huge power that is like completely above their popularity. I don't think that's healthy for the country. Hopefully that won't be the case in the next government, and there's going to be a broad government that includes, you know, the mainstream of Israeli society, and I think that's going to go a long way. And hopefully there's going to be a, you know, more calm, you know, the way the world is going, the way the Middle East is going, you know, beyond the headlines, looks to me like there's going to be a longer period of calm right now because things are getting more clear, and you know, Israel in a way sacrifice its reputation on a global scale in order to, you know, create a security shield around its territory that I think will allow for a longer period of time. And hopefully that period of time will also help Israel, you know, go back to the period in which it is more accepted on a global level. You know, Israel has that dichotomy where it has to look really tough in the Middle East, but really nice in the rest of the world. and the last 3 years were about being tough in the Middle East only. Everything else went to the back burner. Hopefully, that's going to change, and I am optimistic that the conditions that Israel has right now will allow for that to happen, and the conditions that have been created in the Middle East, where you have the possibility of peace with Lebanon and you have ties with the Gulf states that have never been stronger. I think it's going to be an interesting couple of years, and hopefully years that allow for Israeli to society to heal and to focus on creating and innovating, which is what they do better than anyone.
Bezrat Hashem, like really from your mouth to God's ears. Okay, let's kind of go back to the movie a little bit and talk about the movie and some of the experiences making the movie. Did I understand from the B-roll and the conversation with Ehud Olmert that you guys ran into him at the protest? Is that how you set up the interview with him? Did you just see him and say, "Hey, I'm doing this documentary. Can I come and have an interview with you?"
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it was, I have family in Israel. I have an aunt who was very involved I mean, not in organizing the protest, but in participating in the protest. And she texts me, there is a joint Jewish Arab demonstration in Abima Square. You should cover that, because at the beginning we were not able to interview a lot of Arab politicians and members of society because a lot of them saw this whole thing about the judicial reform as something that the Jews are dealing with, that we have our own problems. This is their problem, so they didn't really want to talk about the judicial reform because they felt that that's not their issue. But this particular demonstration was related because it was about violence in the Arab sector and how they were demanding more police presence and blaming Ben Gvir for not giving them police presence. So we went to the demonstration, and I see Ehud Olmert in the center of it, and I tell my wife that's Ehud Olmert. We haven't been able to reach him because we had tried. We were trying to reach everybody in Israel, and we had tried to reach him, and we couldn't. And my wife approached him and said, "We are doing this documentary about division in Israeli society. We would love to interview you." You see a little bit of a shot with her talking to Olmert in the demonstration, and he immediately called one of his assistants or secretaries and said, give them your number and we'll call you, and we'll set it up. And I think that was on a Thursday, and we interviewed him on a Tuesday, on the immediate Tuesday. It was very Israel is very informal, it's like a big JCC, once you get to the person, everything flows. And if you see he's wearing a t-shirt and
Mm-hmm.
everything is very informal. And it was a really incredible interview. I mean, there were truly mind-blowing sound bites in that interview that didn't really apply to the documentary, but he told all the story about how the peace plan that he presented to Mahmoud Abbas, and how he didn't even get a response, but like the amount of concessions that he was willing to make in order to make peace with the Palestinians is mind blowing, and it was mind blowing before October 7. When you listen to it right now, it's like wow. But yeah, I mean, we ran into him, and it was still, I mean, even though by then we already had like a couple of months in Israel, it was still crazy to me that the former prime minister is, in a demonstration from the Arab sector because, you being in a way trained by the foreign view of the conflict, to think that there is tension between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, and you would think that there is a security issue if a former prime minister is in a demonstration of the Arab sector. So you immediately think that that is a security threat, and it's nothing is further from the truth. And part of what I think made the documentary special is that I was learning. I was in a journey of understanding Israel, even though I've been there all my life. I mean, many times in my life, and I felt before making the documentary that I had a good grasp on Israeli society. I learned so much in the process, and I think a lot of people who watch the documentary have the same reaction. Even Israelis tell me, there were stuff I didn't know, and I think that is, at the end of the day, the key to dealing with this subject of Israel, because so much of the problem Israel has when it comes to its image, it has to do with propaganda frankly on both sides, because both sides
Hmm.
present a black and white picture of a country that doesn't exist. The anti-Semites portray, this crazy country, but the pro-Israel crowd presents this perfect country that also doesn't exist and doesn't need to be perfect in order to be loved, in order to be respected and supported. I think it's a major mistake that the pro-Israel camp has around the world, which is this defensiveness and reluctance to accept the nuance and the complexities of what that country has in particular, but also of what every country has in general. And a lot of the reactions we've had, because we tested this film with like truly like borderline anti-Semites, and it was fascinating because the reaction was always, why didn't anybody tell me that? And it's true. We never tell anybody that. We never admit the complexity of the situation, and it's this understandable sense of guarding Israel because everybody's attacking it. So you guard it like a kid and you say he's perfect, he makes no mistakes, when that is the opposite of what you should do. As a storyteller, when you create a character that you want the audience to identify with, you don't make him perfect. I always use the Beauty and the Beast as an example. When you look at Gascon, he's perfect, he's good looking, he thinks he's perfect, he's the villain. But Israel is the beast. Israel is a victim of its own problems, is a victim of the outside enemies, but it's also a victim of his own demons. But it's a creature that is constantly thriving to love, thriving to make peace, thriving to like be harmonious with its neighbors, but sometimes can't. And that's the hero of that story, and I feel like we have been promoting Gascon as if that's Israel, and the effect is the same effect you get with Gascon, which is everybody in the audience hates the guy, and it's not true. That's not who we are. It's a very big misconception of that country, and I don't know if it can be changed, because you'd be surprised by the amount of Jews who wouldn't want to even engage with my documentary, because it shows nuance and it shows imperfect, and we had like Jewish institutions that watch it, and the guy says, I think it's the most important documentary of the year, but I can't show it because I have donors who may get offended on this side or on that side, and Jewish funds that had a donor who is a settler or a donor who is on the extreme left, and he was upset, you know, and that's why we can't win, because there is no ability to portray Israel in its complexity and all the opinions that are around it, which I find the biggest, best thing that the nation has, that is a thriving democracy where everybody disagrees and everybody can say whatever they want, and there is truly like a level of freedom of speech that I have never seen anywhere else. And that brings you closer, when we show it to a group of Spanish left wingers, they were deeply identified with the Israeli left and with the women's movement and all that stuff, and they started realizing that a lot of the causes they fight for in Spain are the causes that the left wing in Israel fights for. So they, at the beginning of the film, maybe they hated all of Israel. At the end of the film, they hated half of Israel, and that's a win, but that's normal. You want people to identify with their peers in any society, and then that's what makes you see Israel as a real country with complexities. And you may not like what this politician said or what that politician said, but that doesn't mean is this crazy entity that is trying to take over the world and all these ways that it is portrayed. It's just not the reality of the country. And I think we should all make an effort to talk about reality because we win when we talk about reality, because we are not the villain of the story. So there's no need to hide anything. There's a need to expose the good, the bad, and the ugly about a really difficult and fascinating society.
I honestly, I couldn't agree more. I think that was, yeah, yeah, very astute, very wise, and honestly, just thank you. Thank you for the film. Thank you for your time today. And yeah, is there anything else that you want to say to our audience before I let you go here?
No, thank
No?
you, and tell your friends about the film, have discussions about it, and make other films that deal with these subjects, and also see if you are also being driven into intolerance in your own society and your own community, because I see it all the time, even on a micro level. People that you have met your entire life suddenly start saying the most radical things, and you're like, dude, what happened to you? And that's the thing. The algorithms are driving us nuts, and we gotta resist. We gotta push against that, and realize that what we have in our societies is very important and very valuable, and we gotta protect it.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks for your
Thank you.
time. And yeah, again, congrats on a really, really great piece of work and a truly important film that I hope lots of people get to see.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
for showing it and for this conversation.